and I do think that there's different ways of ministering God's word during this sort of time of lockdown and when we're not at churches. But I do find that having yourselves in front of me and having a live interaction is much better than some of the pre-recorded formats that I've also experienced. So it's just nice to have a wee bit of engagement, whether it be you looking bored or falling asleep or drinking your coffee or whatever you're doing. It's just nice to have, or your sweets, Siobhan. It's nice to have the engagement, and that means a lot. We're turning to the book of James chapter 5. There are a few verses there I want to read, and then there'll be quite a bit that I want to just try and pull out of the passage. So it's James chapter 5, and we're going to start reading from verse 7. James chapter 5, begin to read at verse 7. It says there, "Be patient, therefore, brothers, until the coming of the Lord. See how the farmer waits for the precious fruit of the earth, being patient about it until it receives the early and late rains. You also be patient, establish your hearts, for the coming of the Lord is at hand. Do not grumble against one another, brothers, so that you may not be judged. Behold, the judge is standing at the door. As an example of suffering and patience, brothers, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord. Behold, we consider those blessed who remain steadfast. You have heard of the steadfastness of Job, and you have seen the purpose of the Lord, how the Lord is compassionate and merciful. But above all, my brethren, do not swear either by heaven or by earth or by any oath, but let your yes be yes and your no be no, so that you may not fall under condemnation." And there we end the reading. I was doing a little bit of research just in the previous day or two. I was preparing for this. The Wizard of Oz. I'm sure we've all seen The Wizard of Oz. First screened in 1939. Widely regarded as one of the greatest films of all time. And whilst the plot centers on the experiences of Dorothy in the Land of Oz, it concludes with the predicament that she ends up losing what was perceived as her only way home via a hot air balloon. You know, they exposed the wizard. He wasn't much of a wizard at the end of it all. And then the plan was that she was going to go home in a hot air balloon. And then that all fell through, and she was stuck in the Land of Oz, as I understand it. And she was soon to discover that by clicking her red shoes, and it was red because they suited the new Technicolor experience. Apparently they were going to be silver or white, and then they realized that the brighter colors suited the new Technicolor because they just moved out of black and white into color, and The Wizard of Oz was one of those first sort of big color films. So she had these red shoes, and she could click these red shoes and she could go home at any time. And sometimes in the Christian life, we want to be a Dorothy character, and we want to have the ability to go home at any time. And we want to avoid much of the hardship which is prevalent in the world. But just like the journey in Oz, there are many experiences which we have to go through before we're ready for heaven. And James, in this passage, he tells us to be patient and to be prepared to wait for the Lord's return. We do not have Dorothy's red shoes. And we're looking at patience in this passage, and it sort of covers a number of different sort of ideas. But we see, first of all, we see patience in difficult circumstances. It says there, verse 7, "Be patient, therefore, brothers." And the Macmillan Dictionary says, "Therefore" is used as a way of showing how a sentence or clause is related to what has already been said. So we need to ask ourselves what has been said before. Well, previously, James was speaking about a warning to the rich, to those who oppress the poor and inflict hardship. And this section now presents some encouragement to those who have suffered injustice, just like what James was previously referring to. So it's about, being patient in the midst of hardship and difficulties and all that are currently going on. And Albert Barnes, he says, those whom he addressed were doubtless suffering under those oppressions, and his object was to induce them to bear their wrongs without murmuring and without resistance. One of the methods of doing this was by showing them in an address to the rich oppressors that those who injured and wronged them would suitably be punished at the day of judgment, or that their cause was in the hands of God. And basically, James was trying to sort of bring that to the readers, saying, listen, God's going to deal with those who are inflicting punishment and difficulty. And his tone in the first 6 verses is quite sharp. He speaks about, come now, you rich, weep and howl for the miseries that are come upon you. But then in verse 7, he says, be patient, therefore, brethren or brothers. And there's a softer tone. And he wants them to learn something here. And he's speaking, to brothers and sisters in the Lord. And we need to take heed to what the Lord is saying to us, particularly if we are facing difficulties on this earth as well. So we need to be patient in difficult circumstances. We need to also be patient in the return of the Lord as well. And this was a part of the passage that really sort of resonated with me, and I sort of thought about it quite a lot over this past few days. And we see there in verses 6, 7, and 8, he says, be patient therefore, brothers, until the coming of the Lord. And then he says in verse 8, the coming of the Lord is at hand. Verse 9, behold, the judge is standing at the door. And James is saying that the readers needed to be patient and wait for the coming of the Lord. And for the original readers, this was going to be either removal through death, or the destruction of the city of Jerusalem, bringing an end to the Jewish institutions, or else it was going to be a judgment of the world and Christ receiving of all believers. At this point, all injustices would be resolved and sorted out, but no one knew when this would be, and everyone had to be prepared to wait. And for us as well, it's like the scenario where you're maybe invited to, or you've maybe seen on TV or on some film, a house party that people have been invited to, and maybe there's been people there, or yourselves and your partner have decided to leave early, which you're able to do because you've got your own transport. And so whenever the whole thing is starting to go sour, you pull out and you save yourselves the hassle of the impending row. But was it the right thing to do? And sometimes, we feel that because of who we are, we want to be able to pull out of a particular circumstance or situation and, as it were, get off the bus. It's as if we're going in Dublin there, and the way on the buses there, you can press the button and the bus will stop at the next stop and you can get off the bus. And sometimes, we feel in this life, we want to get off. There was a song, I think Declan Nerney sung the song, Stop the World and Let Me Off. And we feel as if we want to get off at the next stop. And James is telling us to be patient. We need to exhibit some fruit of the Spirit. It says there in Galatians chapter 5 and verse 22, the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness. And we need to let God take control of our lives and to follow his leading, concerning the return of the Lord. And, there has to be balance in the Christian life. In one hand, and James, I suppose, recognized this, on one hand, there's the yearning to be with Christ, which is far better. But on the other hand, there's a work for the Lord that has to be done. And we need to find the balance, learn to be patient, and serve him in the meantime until the Lord calls us home. There's no point just saying, oh, Lord, take me home. I want to get out of here. I want to get out of this coronavirus. Oh, all these things are going on. And these are things that were familiar with the apostles as well. Paul, he says in 1 Philippians chapter 21, he says, for me to live is Christ, and to die is gain. If I am to go on living in the body, this will mean fruitful labor for me. Yet what shall I choose? I do not know. So he saw that to be with Christ, which was going to be far better, but to live on this earth was going to mean service for the Lord. And he was torn between the two. We're in the same situation. And sometimes, we want to try and avoid all the hardships by the Lord taking us home. C.H. Spurgeon, he said, if God had willed it, each of us might have entered heaven at the moment of conversion. It was not absolutely necessary for our preparation for immortality that we should tarry here. It is possible for a man to be taken to heaven and to be found ready to be a partaker of the inheritance of the saints in light, though he has but just believed in Jesus. It is true that our sanctification is a long and continued process, and we shall not be perfected till we lay aside our bodies and enter within the veil. But nevertheless, had the Lord so willed it, he might have changed us from imperfection to perfection and have taken us to heaven at once. Why then are we here? Would God keep his children out of paradise a single moment longer than was necessary? Why is the army of the living God still on the battlefield when one charge might give them the victory? Why are his children still wandering hither and thither through a maze when a solitary word from his lips would bring them into the center of their hopes in heaven? The answer is they are here that they may live unto the Lord, as we read in Romans chapter 14 and verse 8, and may bring others to know his love. We remain on earth as sowers to scatter good seed, as plowmen to break up the fallow ground, as heralds publishing salvation. We are here as salt of the earth, to be a blessing to the world. Let us see that our life answereth its end. Let us live earnest, useful, holy lives to the praise of the glory of his grace. And so basically, James says we're to be patient in difficult circumstances, and also in the return of the Lord. We're to wait, and we have a job to do. We also see James in chapter 5 and verse 7, he speaks in the example, we see patience in the example of the farmer. He says, see how the farmer waits for the precious fruit of the earth, being patient about it until it receives the early and late rains. James is saying that we need to learn to wait like a farmer. Normally, seed is planted in anticipation of rain and the expectation of an increase in crop. There's no guarantee. Albert Barnes says we should wait for things to develop themselves in their proper season and should not be impatient before that season arrives. In due time, we may expect the harvest to be ripened. We cannot hasten it. We cannot control the rain, the sun, the season, and the farmer therefore patiently waits until in the regular course of events he has a harvest. So we cannot control and hasten events which are in God's own keeping, and we should patiently wait for the developments of his will and the arrangements of his providence, which we may obtain, by which we may obtain what we desire. We have to wait to receive. And, God's purposes are worked out over long periods of time. No farmer sows a seed and goes out a week later expecting a mature crop. We have to wait for these things. And it was worth waiting for. It was viewed as precious. And we were reminded of what it says in Galatians chapter 6 and verse 9. And let us not grow weary of doing good, for in due season we will reap if we do not give up. So we see patience in the example of the farmer. And also we see patience in the example of others in verse 10. As an example of suffering and patience, brothers, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord. And many of the prophets that James would have been thinking of were people who were criticized, despised, chased down, exiled, tortured, and even put to death just for telling people what God said. There was Jeremiah. And Jeremiah told the king of the time the word of the Lord. And what did the king do? After they'd read out the scroll, they went and they tore the scroll up and burned it. And they had to rewrite it out again or whatever they did. So the prophets exercised a lot of patience, not only with godless people, but also in waiting for God's timing on things. There was Noah, for example. He had to be patient for 120 years before the ark started to float. Like for 120 years, surely in the back of his mind, he was wondering, like, Lord, what are you doing? When's this going to happen? And he had to wait 120 years. Abram and Sarah had to learn that God does not have biological clocks and that a few years of a wait is nothing for an eternal God. So a lot of other people in the Bible had to wait as well. And yet we live in this sort of instant society where, we can have, if we've forgotten to take out the bread the night before, what do? We go and break off a couple of slices out of the frozen loaf, stick it in the microwave and thaw it. We're used with things happening right away. And these people had to learn to wait. There was the example of Job. We see his patience as well. We consider, it says in verse 11, those blessed who remain steadfast. You have heard of the steadfastness of Job, and you have seen the purpose of the Lord, how the Lord is compassionate and merciful. The term patience of Job is a famed phrase of biblical origin. We see it used in the King James Version. However, the phrase may not be accurate to Job's experience at that time. And most biblical scholars agree that the Greek word translated by the King James Version as patience probably means more like endurance or persistence. And Job's story is extreme in the amount of suffering he endured. Job lost all of his children and his wealth in a single day. He then was covered in painful sores, and his wife offered him no support. There you go, woman. His wife offered no support, and she encouraged him to give up, curse God, and die. And when Job's three friends came to comfort him, they could not even recognize him from a distance. Adding to Job's pain, his friends falsely accused him of wrongdoing and blamed his troubles on his unrepentant heart. Through it all, Job patiently endured. And the enduring was more of a thing than the patience. And James uses Job as a prime example of patience in suffering because of what may have been in store for James's readers. All what James was reading about, he was thinking of the readers. He was thinking about things that they were going to face and they were going to go through. And by the time of the writing of the epistle of James, Stephen had already been killed as the first Christian martyr in Acts 6 and 7. The early Jewish Christians had fled from Jerusalem in Acts chapter 8. Saul had arrested Christians in Acts chapter 9. And by Acts chapter 12, James the apostle, that is not the writer of the epistle, had been killed, and Peter had escaped death. So there's lots of things happening, and James the writer here was saying you're going to have to learn to endure and to persevere. So when James wrote this epistle, it was a troubling time, and the believers were in need of much endurance. And with the many forms of suffering facing these early Christians, it was important to be reminded that they, like Job, had done nothing to deserve their suffering, but were patiently to endure for the sake of Christ. Just as Job faced many struggles, they would face hardship in living for God. And we're reminded of what it says in Romans chapter 5 and verses 2 to 4. Through him we have obtained access by faith into this grace in which we stand. And we need that grace. It says also, and we rejoice in the hope of the glory of God. Not only that, but we rejoice in our sufferings, knowing that suffering produces endurance, and endurance produces character, and character produces hope. We need patience in our expectations. We not only did we see patience in the example of Job, in the example of others, in the example of the farmer, and in the return of the Lord, and in difficult circumstances, but we need patience as well. And we need patience in our expectations of others. In verse 9, it says that, do not grumble against one another, brothers, so that you may not be judged. Behold, the judge is standing at the door. Somebody has said that when we are impatient with others, then we start to judge them. Now, if you imagine, like for example, whenever you're driving the car, and I have to admit, I will be prone to this. If you've someone there at a roundabout in front of you, and they're dithering, you know what dithering is? They're should they go, should they not, and they're dithering, and you're saying to yourself, would you go on? You know what I mean? And then you start, after that, then you start sort of blaming them and criticizing their driving, and at the same time, we don't know what's going on there. We don't know whether it's an old person, a young person. We don't know whether they've got one eye, or they've bad hearing, or they've got a bad leg, or we don't know what's going on, and we're judging them. And James is speaking about that, and he's saying that we shouldn't be doing that, because the judge is standing at the door, and he's saying, don't judge so you won't be judged. And James basically got this whole idea from what Jesus, his half-brother, said in Matthew 7, judge not that you be not judged, for with the judgment you pronounce, you will be judged, and with the measure you see it will be measured to you. And we have to accept that other people may not have the same education, the same driving experience, the same life skills as us, and so we need to be patient with them. We don't know what's going on. We don't know what their backstory is. So we need to be patient in our expectation of others. And we need to be patient in our commitment to others as well. It says there in verse 8 of James 5, be patient, establish your hearts, for the coming of the Lord is at hand. And then it says in verse 12, but above all, my brothers, do not swear either by heaven or by earth or by any other oath, but let your yes be yes and your no be no. And James warned Christians in the midst of trying circumstances, do not swear. And we must remember the vocal demonstration of Peter whenever he would deny the Lord. And he was swearing, he was saying that he was taking oaths, and he was saying that he didn't know Christ at all. And James is not condemning the use of solemn oaths, but he's condemning the flippant use of God's name or a sacred object to guarantee the truth of what is spoken. And the Jews, they were notoriously guilty of common swearing by heaven, by earth, by Jerusalem, by the temple, by the altar, and by other things as well. And they, whilst they were not considered binding oaths, there was no big commitment in what was agreed, and it was just sort of a flippant thing. And then the question is asked, why above all things is swearing forbidden? Now, there are a few points here. First of all, because it strikes directly at the honor of God and most expressly throws contempt on his name and authority. Also because this sin has the least temptation to it. It is not gain, nor pleasure, nor reputation that can move men to it, but is a shameless and disrespecting of God. Also, because it is hard to prevent when one is used doing it. And also, how can the name of the Lord be a strong tower when we misuse it at all other times? And so basically, James is saying, don't be swearing. James does not mention the swearing as an add-on, but it is a principle of being committed, which he wants to bring to the reader. He says, let your yes be yes and your no be no. Be committed, basically endure, be trustworthy, dependable. He wants you to be all those things. Preacher Dennis Davidson says, a person with a reputation for exaggeration or lying often can get anyone to believe him at his word alone. Christians should never be like that. Always be honest so that others will believe your simple yes or no. By avoiding lies, half-truths, and omission of the truth, you will become a trustworthy person. If we're trustworthy, people will take us at our word. You know, so there are a few things about patience in this passage. And as I finish up, I ask us all the question, so how are we with patience? First of all, God has been patient with us. He's been changing us from the day that we trusted Christ and making us into what he wants us to be. So too, we need to reciprocate that patience with others, our families and those around us. And if God has been patient with us, if he's shown grace and love and mercy, we need to show that same patience, that same grace, that same love and mercy to others. We need to remember that we need to be patient with God. He is working out his plan of salvation. He's not willing that any should perish, but that all should come to repentance. So let's leave aside the red shoes. Stop wishing that we were home in heaven. Be content to serve and to see his harvest of souls gathered in. We need to be patient. We need to be patient with God. We need to be patient with the work that God is doing through us. We need to be patient with people that we're trying to reach. That seed doesn't spring up overnight, but we just have to wait in God's time, and that he will bring his harvest in, and he will bring us home in due course in his will and in his plan. Let's just pray. Thank you, Lord, for these thoughts about patience. Thank you, Lord, for all that James was speaking about. And we recognize, Lord, that his readers were going through hardship and difficult times. And sometimes we feel that we'd want to, as it were, have the wings of a dove and fly away and be present with the Lord. And yet, Lord, there's a work for us to do. Grant us the patience, the grace and mercy that we need to make a difference in the world in which we live. And Lord, that the seed that we have sown, that we will see an increase in it in our time. And Lord, that you will reap the harvest of souls that you have planned before you come again onto this earth. For we pray it in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen. Thank you for having me. Thank you for your kind attention this morning.
Thanks, Mervyn. That was lovely.